This story isn't going to paint me in a good light, and I don't care. I've come to terms with the fact that people will think I'm a monster, maybe even worse than what I hunt. Hell, maybe I am. But you deserve to know what happened, and I need to tell someone. Not to clear my conscience, I don't have one of those left, but to warn you there's stuff out there you don't want to mess with, no matter how sure of yourself you think you are. Let me start from the beginning. I've been doing spirit work for almost a decade now. It's not some Hollywood exorcist gig where you wave a crucifix around and scream Latin phrases. No, it's uglier than that, messier. Real exorcisms involve hours of screaming, pissing, puking, and sometimes blood. You get scratched, bitten, spat on, and once in a while, you'll see shit that sticks with you no matter how much you try to drink it away. But the pay is good, especially when you're willing to go after the real nasty ones. People come to me when the church turns them away or when the cops laugh in their faces. I deal with the stuff that can't be explained, and yeah, it's made me some enemies, but it's also made me cocky. That's probably why I ended up on the dark web that night. Business had been slow and I was bored. It started with me just browsing forums for weird cases, stuff that might be worth looking into. Then I found this thread about a guy offering money for spirit work. The details were vague, but the payout was obscene. $100,000 just to neutralize an entity tied to him. No questions asked. Now, most people would have noped out right there. You don't go looking for jobs on the dark web unless you're desperate or insane. But me, I'm both. So I shot him an email. The response came within minutes. He called himself Mr. Ash, and he gave me an address. A rotting mansion about 2 hours from where I lived. Said he'd explain everything in person. Against my better judgment, I packed up my kit, a bag full of salt, sage, iron nails, and a knife I'd had blessed by a Santeria priest. I threw in my gun too, just in case. The drive out there was uneventful, but the house was something else. Picture every haunted house cliché you've ever seen. Peeling paint, boarded up windows, a yard overgrown with weeds. The place stank of mildew and something sweeter, like decaying meat. Mr. Ash met me at the door. He was tall, dressed in a suit that didn't quite fit right, and his skin was this sickly, almost translucent white. His eyes, Jesus, his eyes were solid black, like polished obsidian. I told myself it was some kind of medical condition, but I wasn't convinced. He led me inside without a word. The place was empty, except for a single chair in the middle of the living room. It was old and wooden, with straps bolted to the arms and legs, the kind of thing you'd see in a torture chamber. "I need you to remove it," he said, his voice flat. "The thing that's been following me, it's inside me now. I want it out." I've dealt with possession cases before, so this wasn't exactly new territory. But there was something about him, something about the way he just stared at me like he was studying me for weaknesses. It made my skin crawl. Still, the money was too good to pass up. I told him to sit in the chair. He didn't argue, just walked over and strapped himself in like he'd done it 1,000 times before. That's when I started to realize just how messed up this was going to get. Exorcisms are all about power, establishing dominance over whatever's inside the host. Usually that means invoking some kind of higher authority, God, the universe, whatever you believe in. But Mr. Ash, he didn't want me to use any of that. "No prayers," he said, "no holy water, just pain, hurt it, make it suffer until it lets go." Now I've seen spirits react to pain before. They hate it when you mess with their anchors, objects, or people they've latched onto. But torturing the host, that's a whole other level of messed up. I should have walked away right then, but the money, and maybe a sick part of me that wanted to see what would happen, kept me there. I started with the basics. Salt-burned spirits, so I sprinkled a circle around the chair. Then I lit some sage and waved it around him, watching for any reaction. Nothing. "Harder," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I hesitated, but I grabbed my iron knife and pressed the tip against his arm. The skin sizzled and he flinched, but he didn't scream. Instead, he smiled, a slow, toothy grin that made my stomach churn. "It's waking up," he said, and then it did. His body started convulsing, pulling against the straps so hard I thought they'd snap. His eyes rolled back, and this guttural growl came out of his throat, low and wet, like an animal choking on its own blood. I backed away, knife in hand, as the air around him grew cold. The lights flickered, and shadows danced on the walls, moving in ways they shouldn't. Then he stopped. Just stopped. His head snapped up, and those black eyes locked onto mine. But it wasn't him anymore. "Do you think this will end well for you?" The thing inside him rasped. Its voice was layered, like a dozen people speaking at once. "Do you think you're the first to try this?" I didn't answer. Talking to them never helps. Instead, I grabbed the salt and threw a handful at his chest. He screamed, this horrible, inhuman wail that made my ears ring. But it didn't stop. "More," Mr. Ash's voice said, though I could tell it wasn't really him. "Hurt me more." So I did. I pressed the knife against his skin again, this time harder. The smell of burning flesh filled the room, and I gagged, but I didn't stop. The thing inside him howled, thrashing and snapping its teeth at me. And then it laughed. "You think you're in control?" it said. "You don't even know what I am." That's when the shadows on the walls started moving towards me. If I could go back and stop myself from walking into that house, I would. I'd slap the knife out of my hand, drag myself out by the collar, and scream at myself to just leave. But it's too late for that. When those shadows started moving toward me, I froze. I mean, what the hell are you supposed to do when darkness starts crawling? It wasn't just the way they moved, it was how they felt. Heavy, oppressive, like they carried weight, even though they didn't belong to anything I could see. I gripped the knife tighter and tried to focus on Mr. Ash, or whatever was sitting in that chair now. His body wasn't moving anymore, but his head tilted to the side, watching me with those black, dead eyes. "You're not ready for this," the thing hissed, its voice slithering around the room like smoke. "You're nothing but a child, playing with knives in the dark." I wanted to shout back, but my throat had closed up. I could barely breathe, let alone speak. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was in too deep. If I bailed, there was no way I'd get my money. Worse, I wasn't sure I'd even make it out alive. So I did the only thing I could think of. I lunged forward and drove the knife into his leg. The reaction was instant. The room shook, like the foundation of the house itself was rebelling against what I'd just done. The shadows stopped creeping and surged toward me all at once, slamming into the salt circle. Sparks flew as they hit the barrier, and the air filled with the stench of burnt ozone. Mr. Ash, or whatever was inside him, screamed, thrashing so violently I thought he'd tear himself apart. His wrists bled where the straps cut into them, and his neck bent at an angle that didn't seem humanly possible. For a second I thought I'd won, but then the thing did something I wasn't ready for. It started talking to me. "You think you're strong because you can hurt me," it said, its voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. "But you don't know pain. Not real pain. Not yet." The shadows pulled back, retreating to the edges of the room like they were waiting for something. And then I felt it. A pressure inside my head, like someone was digging their fingers into my brain. Images flashed behind my eyes, too fast to process at first, but then they slowed down and I realized what I was seeing. It was me, but not me as I was now. It was me as a kid, maybe 6 or 7, sitting on the floor of my childhood home. My mum was in the kitchen yelling at my dad about something. I don't remember what, but I remember the sound of glass breaking when he threw a bottle against the wall. I remember her crying, begging him to stop. The thing inside Mr. Ash laughed, and suddenly I was back in the present. "Do you remember what you did next?" it asked. I shook my head, but I did remember. I remembered running into the kitchen and grabbing the biggest knife I could find. I remembered standing there, shaking, as my dad turned to look at me with that drunken sneer on his face. "You wanted to kill him," the thing said, its voice dripping with glee. "You wanted to bury that knife in his chest and watch him bleed." "Shut up," I muttered, but my voice cracked. "But you didn't. You're weak, always have been, always will be." The pressure in my head grew worse, and the memories kept coming. Times I'd failed, times I'd been too scared to act. Every mistake I'd ever made, every moment of shame and regret played out in vivid detail. I fell to my knees, clutching my head, as the thing's laughter grew louder. "Do you want to know why I'm here?" it asked. I didn't answer. "It's because you called me, not him, you." My stomach dropped. "That's not true," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure I believed them. "Oh, but it is," the thing purred. "You've been calling to me your entire life. Every angry thought, every hateful wish, every moment you spent fantasizing about hurting someone, it was all an invitation. And now, here we are." I wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, I knew it was right. While I was on the floor trying to keep my head from splitting open, Mr. Ash started laughing again. But this time, it wasn't just him. The shadows joined in, their voices low and guttural, filling the room with a sound that made my skin crawl. I forced myself to my feet, gripping the knife so hard my knuckles turned white. The salt circle was still holding, but I could see cracks forming in the barrier, tiny fissures that spread with every second. "You're running out of time," the thing said. "Do you want to live, or do you want to die here, screaming in the dark?" "I want you out of him," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. It tilted its head again like it was considering my words. "Very well," it said. "But if I leave him, I'll need someone else to take my place." I froze. "I can give you power," it continued, its voice soft and seductive. "Strength, control, all the things you've ever wanted. All you have to do is say yes." For a second, I almost did. I almost gave in. But then I remembered the way it had made me feel, helpless, broken, like I was nothing. And I realized that no matter what it offered, I couldn't trust it. "Go to hell," I spat. It didn't seem angry. If anything, it looked amused. "Have it your way," it said. And then the shadows surged forward, shattering the salt circle and plunging the room into darkness. When the salt circle broke, it felt like someone flipped a switch in the universe. The air grew thicker, like it was alive and pressing down on me. I could barely see, barely breathe. The knife in my hand felt useless, like a toy I'd stolen from a kid's Halloween costume. The shadows didn't just move anymore, they attacked. They surged forward, cold and oily, wrapping around my legs and pulling me to the floor. I thrashed, trying to free myself, but it was like fighting quicksand. The more I struggled, the tighter they gripped. And then I saw it. In the darkness, something began to take shape. It started as a writhing mass, too many limbs, too many eyes, all of it moving in ways that defied logic. My brain tried to make sense of it, tried to assign it a form, but every time I thought I understood what I was looking at, it shifted. "Do you see me now?" the thing whispered. Its voice was softer than before, almost gentle, but that just made it worse. It wasn't trying to scare me anymore. It was savoring me like a predator toying with its prey. "I see you," I managed to choke out, though I wasn't sure if it was true. Good, it said. Then you know how this ends. I didn't want to believe it, but part of me did. Whatever this thing was, it was older than anything I'd ever faced, stronger, smarter. And it wasn't just in Mr. Ash anymore, it was everywhere. In the walls, the floor, the air I was breathing. Still, I wasn't ready to give up. I reached into my bag and grabbed the iron nails, scattering them across the floor. Iron disrupts spirits, and I hoped it would buy me some time. For a moment, it seemed to work. The shadows recoiled, hissing like animals burned by fire. But the relief was short-lived. Clever, the thing said, its voice coming from behind me now. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just more shadows, stretching and twisting like they were alive. But you can't fight me with toys, little hunter. Not here. And then the floor opened up. I'm not exaggerating when I say that. 1 second, I was standing on solid ground. The next, it was gone. I fell into darkness, my stomach lurching as gravity pulled me down. It wasn't a long fall, but it felt like it went on forever. When I hit the ground, the impact knocked the wind out of me. My knife flew from my hand, clattering somewhere in the dark. I tried to get up, but the ground wasn't stable. It shifted beneath me like I was standing on the surface of some giant breathing creature. The smell hit me next, sour and metallic like rotting meat soaked in blood. "Welcome," the thing said, its voice echoing from all directions. "This is where I live." The darkness around me began to change. Shapes emerged, though I couldn't tell if they were real or just tricks of the light, if you could even call it light. The walls pulsed, fleshy and wet, and the ground squelched under my hands as I crawled forward. I found my knife, half buried in the muck, and held it tight. It was the only thing that felt real, the only thing that grounded me in this nightmare. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice shaky but loud enough to cut through the oppressive silence. The thing didn't answer right away. Instead, it let me sit there, waiting, stewing in my own fear. Then, finally, it spoke. "I want to show you what you really are," it said. And that's when the screaming started. At first, I thought the screams were coming from the walls. But then I saw them, figures emerging from the fleshy mass around me. They were human, or at least they had been once. Their bodies were twisted and broken, their faces contorted in eternal agony. One of them reached for me, its fingers long and skeletal, and I scrambled back, slipping in the muck. "Help us," it moaned, its voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to help, but another part, the louder, more selfish part, just wanted to get out of there. "They're mine," the thing said, almost possessively. Each one of them thought they could control me. They thought they could win. And now, they're here. Forever. I tried not to look at them, but it was impossible. They were everywhere, their eyes following me as I moved. Some of them were crying, others were laughing. Horrible, hollow laughter that made my skin crawl. "Is this what you want?" the thing asked. "To end up like them?" "No," I said, my voice barely audible. "Then make a choice," it said. "Take the power I've offered you, or stay here. With them." I knew it was lying. Of course it was lying, but in that moment, with the screams echoing in my ears and the ground shifting beneath me, I wasn't sure I cared. Before I could say anything, one of the figures lunged at me, its hands wrapped around my ankle, pulling me down into the muck. I screamed, slashing at it with the knife, but it didn't let go. "Please," it whispered, its voice raw and desperate. "Don't leave us." I kicked at it, panic overtaking me, and finally, it let go. I scrambled to my feet, running blindly through the darkness. The thing laughed, the sound vibrating through the walls. "You can't run," it said. "This is my world." But then I saw it. a faint light in the distance. It wasn't much, just a tiny pinprick, but it was enough to give me hope. I ran toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. The figures tried to grab me as I passed, their hands clawing at my legs, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The light grew brighter as I got closer, and for a moment I thought I might actually make it. But then the thing spoke again, its voice low and cold. "Do you really think you can leave?" it said. The ground beneath me buckled, and I fell again, the knife slipping from my hand. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was that light, so close, yet so impossibly far away. When I hit the ground this time, it was different. It wasn't soft and shifting like before. It was hard, cold, and damp, like concrete slicked with blood. My head smacked against it, and stars exploded behind my eyes. For a moment I couldn't move. My limbs felt like lead, and my chest burned with every breath. All I could do was lie there, staring up into the nothingness, trying to convince myself this was still real. Then I heard footsteps. They weren't loud, just a faint, deliberate tap, 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 but they echoed like gunshots in the silence. Slowly, painfully, I sat up, clutching my side. My knife was gone again, probably lost somewhere in the fall. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until finally I saw him. It was Mr. Ash, or at least it looked like Mr. Ash. His skin was paler now, almost translucent, and his suit was soaked in something dark that dripped onto the floor with every step. But it was his face that made me freeze. It wasn't human anymore. His features were stretched, distorted, like a bad wax figure left out in the sun. His mouth was too wide, his teeth too sharp, and his eyes, those black, bottomless pits, seemed to swallow the light around them. "You've been busy," he said, his voice calm and almost amused. I didn't respond. What could I say? He crouched in front of me, tilting his head like a curious animal. "You know, most people don't last this long," he continued. "They break before they even see me, but you—" He leaned closer, and I had to fight the urge to recoil. "You're special." "Special how?" I asked, though my voice cracked on the last word. His smile widened, showing too many teeth. "You're stubborn," he said. "Stupid, maybe, but stubborn. And I like that." He reached out, his fingers impossibly long, and I flinched, but instead of grabbing me, he tapped the ground between us. "Let's make this simple," he said. "You've proven you're not like the others, so I'm giving you one last chance. Accept my offer, and you walk out of here with everything you've ever wanted. And if I don't—" His smile faded, replaced by something colder. "Then you stay forever." Before I could answer, he reached out again, this time pressing his hand to my forehead. It wasn't a touch, it was an invasion. His fingers burned like ice, and my mind exploded with images. I saw myself in a mirror. But it wasn't the me I knew. This version of me was strong, confident, powerful. People bowed their heads as I passed, their faces filled with fear and awe. I commanded armies, crushed enemies, and ruled over a world that felt both alien and familiar. And then it changed. The mirror cracked, and the images shifted. I saw myself alone, standing in the darkness. My hands were covered in blood. Too much blood, and the bodies piled around me were unrecognizable, but I didn't feel fear or sadness. I felt nothing. "That's what I can give you," Mr. Ash said, his voice echoing in my head. "Freedom, power, a life without weakness, without regret." The vision faded, and I was back on the cold, damp floor. My head throbbed and my body ached, but the promise of what I'd seen lingered. "What's the catch?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "There's always a catch," he said, his smile returning. "But you'll find it's a small price to pay." "And if I say no?" He stood, towering over me now. "Then you'll become one of them," he said, gesturing to the shadows. "A prisoner, a warning to those who come after you." The room shifted around us, and I saw them again. The twisted, broken figures trapped in the walls. Their faces were etched with despair, their eyes hollow. "You'll scream," he said, his voice soft. "But no one will hear you." I wanted to fight. I wanted to stand up, grab my knife, and stab him until there was nothing left. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. He wasn't something I could kill or banish. He was something else, something older, darker, and far beyond my understanding. So, I did the only thing I could. I stalled. "What happens if I take the deal?" I asked. His smile widened. "You'll see," he said. "But trust me, it's better than the alternative." I glanced around the room, searching for anything I could use. My knife was still gone, but the iron nails were scattered across the floor, glinting faintly in the dim light. "Fine," I said, forcing the words out. "I'll do it." His eyes narrowed. "Say it," he said. "I accept your offer," I said, my voice trembling. The moment the words left my mouth, the room erupted with light. Blinding, searing light that burned my eyes and filled my ears with a deafening roar. I felt something cold and slimy wrap around my wrist, pulling me to my feet. And then it was gone. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the living room of the mansion. The chair was empty, the straps dangling loosely. Mr. Ash was gone, and the air was still. For a moment I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I looked at my hands. They were clean, unmarked, but they didn't feel like mine. They felt wrong. And then I heard it, a faint whisper coming from somewhere deep inside me. "Welcome home," it said. I stood there, staring at my hands, trying to shake off the feeling that something was crawling under my skin. The room was quiet, almost too quiet, like the house itself was holding its breath. Then I felt it, a faint tug deep in my chest. It wasn't painful, but it wasn't comfortable either. It was like someone had tied a string around my heart and was gently pulling on it, guiding me towards something. I tried to ignore it, to push it down, but it wouldn't stop. It kept tugging, insistent and relentless, until I couldn't fight it anymore. So I followed. The house was different now. The peeling wallpaper and broken furniture were gone, replaced by smooth, dark walls that seemed to absorb the light. The air was colder, heavier, and with every step I took, the floor felt less solid beneath my feet. The tugging grew stronger, more urgent, leading me to a door at the end of the hallway. It was old and wooden, with strange symbols carved into the surface. They pulsed faintly like they were alive. I didn't want to open it, but my hand moved on its own, grasping the cold metal handle and pulling it open. The room beyond the door was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was massive, impossibly so, with walls that stretched so far into the darkness I couldn't see where they ended. The floor was a swirling mass of black and red, like molten lava mixed with ink, and the air was thick with the stench of sulfur and decay. In the center of the room stood a figure. It wasn't Mr. Ash, but it wasn't entirely unfamiliar either. It was taller now, its limbs elongated and twisted, its face an unrecognizable mass of shadows and teeth. "Do you feel it yet?" it asked, its voice echoing in my head. "Feel what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. It tilted its head, and for a moment I thought I saw something human in its eyes. "The hunger," it said. As soon as it spoke the words, I felt it. It started as a dull ache in my stomach, but it grew quickly, spreading through my body like wildfire. It wasn't the kind of hunger you could satisfy with food. It was deeper, darker. It was a hunger for something I couldn't name, something primal and insatiable. "What did you do to me?" I demanded, my voice shaking. It smiled, its teeth glinting in the dim light. "I gave you what you wanted," it said. "Power, freedom, but every gift comes with a price." I stumbled back, clutching my chest as the hunger grew worse. My vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I saw faces, dozens of them, staring back at me from the shadows. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. "You're mine now," it said. "My vessel, my tool, my hunter." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "No," I said, shaking my head. No, I didn't agree to this. "You did," it said, its voice cold and unyielding. "You said the words, you made the choice, and now you'll do what I tell you." Before I could argue, the room shifted again. The walls melted away, replaced by a scene that was all too real, a small, dingy apartment with peeling paint and a single flickering light bulb. A man sat on the couch, his face buried in his hands. He was muttering to himself, rocking back and forth like he was on the verge of breaking. I didn't know him, but I didn't have to. I could feel his guilt, his fear, his desperation. "This is your first task," the thing said, its voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. "What task?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "He's a killer," it said. "A predator. He's hurt people, children, and he'll keep hurting them unless someone stops him." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "And you want me to kill him?" "I want you to feed," it said. "Take his life, take his soul, make him yours." I shook my head, backing away. "No, I can't." The hunger surged again, cutting me off. It was worse this time, more intense, like my body was tearing itself apart from the inside. "You can," it said, "and you will, or the hunger will consume you instead." I tried to resist, but it was no use. The hunger was too strong, too overwhelming. My vision blurred again, and when it cleared, I was standing over the man, my hands wrapped around his throat. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with terror. "Please," he gasped. "I didn't mean to." I didn't let him finish. I don't know how to describe what happened next. It wasn't like killing someone. It was something worse. As I squeezed his throat, I felt something shift inside me like a door opening. A rush of energy surged through me, cold and electric, as his life drained away. His screams turned into gurgles and then silence, but I wasn't done. I felt his soul, writhing and struggling, and I pulled it into me. It was like drinking poison and nectar at the same time, sickening and intoxicating, painful and euphoric. When it was over, I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The hunger was gone, but in its place was something else. Something darker. "You did well," the thing said, its voice filled with satisfaction. "You'll get used to it." I looked at the man's lifeless body, his face frozen in a mask of terror, and I felt nothing. No guilt, no regret, just emptiness. "What happens now?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Now," it said, "you hunt." I don't know how long it's been since that night. Days, weeks, months, it all blurs together. The thing inside me doesn't let me rest. It whispers in my ear, guiding me to my next target, my next meal. And every time I feed, I lose a little more of myself. I've tried to fight it, to resist, but the hunger always wins. It's stronger than me, stronger than anything I've ever faced. Sometimes I wonder if this is what I wanted all along. Not the power, not the freedom, but the chance to finally let go. To stop pretending I'm a good person. If you're reading this, take my advice. Stay away from the dark web. Stay away from the things that promise you power, or vengeance, or salvation. Because once you invite them in, they never leave. and neither will you.